Greetings, friends of liberty. I do feel it incumbent upon me to mention that I recently again had the pleasure of meeting the Right Honourable William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield, at a recent party. William was the presiding judge, as you may remember, in one of the greatest decisions ever rendered of English jurisprudence, that of Somerset v. Stewart. Easy to remember. Two S's, Somerset v. Stewart. In this case, my friend William, the Chief Justice of all England, had to decide whether a black man who was brought into England as a slave and who had escaped and who was again captured by his master might be set free. In other words, he was asked to determine whether the laws of England, which do not recognize slavery in any form, take precedence in England over the laws of other countries to hold slaves. His decision, of course, which resounded across the length and breadth of England, was that the common law of England recognizes no claims of slaveholders, and thus, since in addition there was also no positive English law or statute which did recognize slavery, Mr. Somerset should be set free. And he was, to everyone's relief, including Mr. Somerset. Now, if we turn to your 21st century, we find here a man, Ibram Kendi, who not only has completely forgotten the pioneering role of My England in destroying slavery as an institution throughout the world, but who has written a book entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist, filled with mistakes. In fact, if I were teaching a course in race relations at one of your American universities, I would assign this book and then would give a full letter grade increase to the final course grade to the student in my class who found the most errors in it. And since I'm a hard grader, that would be of significant value to most students. But getting that extra letter grade increase would be a daunting task, given that this book presents hundreds of falsehoods or false implications, the exact number presently being unknown. If we were to use the alliterative style of that famous American race hustler Jesse Jackson, we describe this book as being an Everest of errors, a Matterhorn of mistakes, or even a mountain of miscues. And this masterpiece of miscomprehension begins when Kendi first tries to define racism, saying, racist, one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. Kind of circular as a definition. Now, fortunately, when we progress further, Kendi does attempt a number of actual, substantive, non-circular definitions. For example, he says, a racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Now, the reality is that, as Dr. Thomas Sowell and many others have pointed out, Kendi has no way of knowing this of a certainty. While it's certainly possible and even likely that culture and personal upbringing are the biggest factors in increasing intelligence and achievement and many other qualities in individuals from different ethnic and racial groups, the present state of the science of genetics is such that we can't know definitively that genetics plays no role. In fact, we know that identical twins have closer IQs than fraternal twins, so the possibility that some genetic component exists in some instances is likely. So this is just a pure assumption on Kendi's part, an affirmation of his ideology. For example, let's examine Jews who have a distinct genetic profile even though they're not a separate race, and who are, by far, the most successful ethnic group in world history. Even though there are only 15 million Jews in the entire world, they have won, for example, in physics, chemistry, economics, and medicine, from 1901 to 2000, 129 Nobels, which is about 25%, more than 2,000 times the Muslim rate. Now, do we know for sure that this is all due to Jewish culture? No. Could be 100% culture, 0% genes, 99-1, 95-5, 90-10, or even 70-30. We simply don't know at present. All we know are the results. Now let's proceed to the second definitional mistake of Kendi, when he says that racism is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. So here finally he gives us something substantive, not a circular definition, the racial inequity part. So he's implying in effect that anytime you see one racial group doing worse than another, that's mainly due to either racism or, as we shall see later, capitalism. So there are two mistakes in his talk about racial inequities. First, he ignores the extremely obvious fact that very often racial and ethnic groups overlap. In other words, different racial groups can have different cultures too. So for example, Asians who are racially different than whites also oftentimes are part of Chinese, Thai, Indian, or Japanese culture. So they can be different racially and culturally. So if, as they do in 2005, Asian American households earn $61,000 opposed to $48,000 for European Americans, then Asian Americans in America would have to be discriminating against whites according to Kendi. Any racial inequity, discrimination, or capitalism. Is Yo-Yo Ma, the famous cellist, discriminating against white cellists? In other words, Kendi's world is a world with no authentic diversity at all. If people differ, it's due to racism or capitalism, not to a different history or culture, or even 1% genetics. But again, the reality is that just like the fact that every single individual differs and is unique and not equal to any other individual in the world, so too different racial and ethnic groups, in fact, are all utterly unique and, like individuals, never equal in their societal and historical performance in any field. So Kendi gets it exactly backwards. You never should expect either individuals or groups in their actual real-world performances to be equal, ever. Let's look at the sports world. In ping pong, 60% of world champions are Chinese, although they make up only 19% of the world population. Is that racism against us poor, uncoordinated whites, Ibram? In the NHL, 93% of hockey players are white. Is that because Bobby Orr and Wayne Gretzky conspired to keep blacks out? Or maybe just because blacks generally don't live in cold countries? Thirdly, only about 27% of basketball players in the NBA are white. Isn't that because generally we whites have an average vertical leap of 8 inches? 58% of pro football players in the NFL are black. Is that because Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders secretly injured white players in the pileup, Ibram? Probably less than 1% of all pro surfers are black. Is that because Laird Hamilton and Kelly Slater conspired to keep blacks out of the surfing lineup at Waikiki? Or instead, just due to the fact that blacks would rather play basketball and football and happen to live in the inner city? Less than 1% of champion swimmers are black. Did Mark Spitz and Michael Phelps give them slow Speedos? And there was apparently only one black grandmaster in the history of chess. Is that because of the evil, racist Magnus Carlsen, Bobby Fischer, and Garry Kasparov? So seeing how brain dead this mistake is, let's leave it and go to Kendi's third mistake, his attempt to induce guilt by saying that in the world there are only racists and anti-racists, but no one neutral to racism. So in one sense, this is clever because it's obviously true, of course, that theoretically you're either for or against racism. Theoretically. But Kendi means or implies that unless someone is actively fighting racism, on a societal level, unless you're some kind of social activist, then you're for it. But again, that's absurd, because even if white on black racism were a practical societal problem today, which it isn't, I might make it my life task to fight another problem, like finding a cure for cancer. Otherwise, I can simply fight it on an individual level as I live my life. But the statement is also wrong in another sense, in the sense of what BLM meant when they shouted Black Lives Matter. Here the rhetorical trick was that by merely saying it, you pretended that it needed to be said. But virtually no one thinks Black lives don't matter. So if you sit there chanting Black Lives Matter, it's like you're chanting 1 + 1 = 2. And this is the same trick that Kendi uses, simply assuming by trying to enlist us in his fictional struggle that white-on-black racism is some practical problem in American society today. But it's obviously not. If we look, for example, at the fact that 71% of black children are born to unwed mothers, is even 1% of that due to David Duke? Or is it instead due to the welfare state and the culture of dependency that exactly Kendi and other liberals have encouraged and institutionalized in America since the 60s? And if we look at the fact that black children often score abysmally in 4th and 8th grade reading and math tests, is that due to Nick Fuentes? Or instead to the pathetic nature of American governmental schools and their state-enforced monopoly, which have damaged black children intellectually and socially for over a century, and which liberals support? Or if we look at black racism against Asians and whites, which is expressed, for example, by the fact that blacks at 12.5% of the population in 2019 had 23.9% of hate crime offenders, whereas whites at 60% had only 52.5% of the offenders, which works out to a black percentage more than twice that of whites, is that disproportionate black racism caused by those good old boys, the Dukes of Hazzard? Or if we look at the huge increase in inner-city violence and harm to addicts caused by the drug war, and black neighborhoods shot up by drug gangs, isn't it true that the drug war was supported historically by both whites and blacks, both Democrats and Republicans? Or if we look at the enormous damage caused to black youth employment rates by minimum wage laws, which price them out of the market, hasn't that been mainly supported by liberals just like Kendi? Or if we look at gun control, a violation of your Second Amendment rights, which historically damaged the ability of Southern blacks to defend themselves against white racists before the Civil Rights era, and now damages blacks in the inner city, preventing them from taking back their neighborhoods from drug dealers, isn't it liberals, just like Kendi, overwhelmingly, who support gun control? But wouldn't that make Kendi himself racist by his own definition, since he's supporting policies which disproportionately harm the black community? And to think that Kendi, whose policies have created such destruction, said, Americans have long been trained to see the deficiencies of people rather than policy. So having addressed Kendi's third mistake, the implication that if we don't actively fight the largely fictional evil of white-on-black racism, we're racists, and having seen that it's exactly anti-capitalist, big government liberals like Ibram Kendi who most damage the black community through policies ranging from public education to the welfare state, to affirmative action, to gun control, to minimum wage laws, let's proceed to his next mistake, his belief that capitalism is intrinsically racist. As he says, to love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. So here again, as is almost uniformly the case, Kendi gets it exactly backwards. One of the most capitalistic countries in world history, especially during the 19th century, was my England, the country that, more than any other, first organized the worldwide drive to abolish the slave trade, and then to abolish slavery itself, thus helping free millions of blacks. Naturally, Kendi, who claims to help my people, doesn't breathe a word of England's superior anti-racist history. Let's briefly summarize for him. Again, in 1772, my friend William Murray, Lord Mansfield, in the case of Somerset v. Stewart, confirmed that slaves could not be held in England, and thus that any slave imported became free upon touching English soil. Number 2, with the Slave Trade Act of 1807, the slave trade was outlawed in the British Empire. Number 3, with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, Britain, before any other country except Haiti, gradually abolished slavery in most of the empire. 4, our magnificent navy, larger and more powerful than that of any other nation during the 19th century, led a crusade to interdict or destroy slave trading ships around the world, capturing over 40 Cuban ships from 1809 to 1819, inducing Argentina to cease the trade by 1840, bombarding Algiers with casualties of over 800 men, pressuring Portugal with its Brazilian and African settlements, finally shutting down the Atlantic trade by 1870, and in the Middle East pressuring the Ottomans, Zanzibar, and Iran. Now, if Kendi had actually looked at all the many other countries around the world which weren't particularly capitalistic throughout Africa or the Middle East, many of which were Muslim, all engaged in slavery longer. In addition, if we go back in history and look at countries like ancient Sparta, which was completely totalitarian and anti-capitalist, just like Kendi is, Sparta was perhaps the greatest slave society ever. Ancient Sparta and slavery, the greatest and most inseparable conjoined twins, bar none. Finally, why did England do it? Go on a crusade to destroy slavery? First and foremost, since the crusade began in the era of the Enlightenment and John Locke and the American and French revolutions, with their understanding of the rights of man and their love of pure liberty, abolitionist societies sprung up across the length and breadth of my country, and they petitioned Parliament on numerous occasions for abolition of the trade and slavery itself. And subsequently, England, that capitalist country, paid for compensation to slave owners, the enormous sum of £20 million out of their tax dollars to free the slaves, and also paid for worldwide naval patrols, as we've just mentioned, and other costs, such as maintaining the colony for freed slaves in Sierra Leone. Pure capitalism, pure hatred of slavery, Ibram. Secondly, England had one of the two greatest navies the world has ever seen, precisely because it was capitalistic. And so the very productivity of our capitalism enabled us to create and then to send that enormously powerful navy around the world, helping to destroy slavery over the course of many decades. Are you starting to grasp that, Ibram? Thirdly, once we as a nation were determined to abolish slavery because we loved freedom, it was also a practical matter of international power politics. Since sugar and coffee plantations were enormously profitable even at this time, if we were not going to own slave plantations, then we were also going to act over time to prevent our rivals, France, Portugal, and Spain, from making huge amounts of money with their own slave trade and slave-grown sugar and coffee. Does Kendi get anything right in this book, theoretically? Well, as they say, even a blind chicken finds a kernel once in a while. First, unlike his fellow CRT theorist Robin DiAngelo, Kendi admits, "I no longer believe a black person cannot be racist." Now, one might suppose that's progress, but then he immediately turns around and implies that black intellectuals who advocate policies resulting in racial inequity, as he thinks, are racist. So, for example, he mentions Justice Clarence Thomas's murderous gang of anti-black judgments over the years as an example of alleged black-on-black racism. Secondly, there may be truth in Kendi's implication that at least sometimes slavery creates racism and not racism slavery. In the American South, it's hard to imagine that without slavery, Southerners would have ended up as racist as they were. In other words, we can potentially see their racism as an excuse, a rationalization which was constructed and developed largely after slavery began to justify them holding other men as slaves. In conclusion, Socrates said, "Know thyself." This is the exact opposite. A book by a man unaware of his profound ignorance of the world, race relations, history, politics, and economics, and so it can only receive a failing grade, my first F. There's little doubt why, to my knowledge, Kendi has never debated any of his well-known intellectual opponents like John McWhorter or Thomas Sowell. The patheticness of his ideas would be too clearly revealed. Incidentally, I plan to soon release another video that simply catalogs, with a brief description, why they're wrong, a much longer list of Kendi's many false statements or implications. Until next time, I bid you well and wish you all a very happy New Year.